It began without fanfare, in the quiet hum of a data server buried beneath an observatory in New Mexico. A simple correction, 1 decimal shift in a trajectory file, flagged an anomaly that shouldn't have existed. 3I, Atlas, the interstellar wanderer already catalogued and simulated, had deviated from its predicted course by a margin too small for the naked eye, yet too precise to ignore. When orbital physicist Dr. Enid Mullen recalculated the vector, she saw it curve not randomly, but consistently, as though tugged by an invisible filament threading through the cosmos. Gravity alone could not explain it. At first, they blamed the instruments. Dust interference, solar wind variability, even minor computational drift, the standard culprits in cosmic misbehavior. But each correction widened the gap. The European Space Agency's Gaia satellite confirmed the deviation from the other side of the Sunday days later. The Deep Space Network corroborated it, triangulating with uncanny accuracy. Across oceans, the same pattern emerged. 3I, Atlas, was responding to a force that wasn't mapped, a force that shouldn't exist. The correction data arrived in encrypted packets, shared discreetly between agencies that normally competed. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory ran a backtrace across 100 million kilometers of space. Their simulation extended the comet's motion backward in time, seeking the point of divergence. What it found raised more questions than answers. The path didn't simply bend, it looped. A microarc, gentle yet deliberate, shifting against the Milky Way's gravitational gradient. It was as if something out there had nudged it, correcting its course across the interstellar dark. In a late-night transmission, Mullen typed a message to her counterpart at ESA. "The pull isn't local. Check galactic reference frame." Hours later came the reply, a single line. "Already did." "It's still there." They both stared at the plots, their screens drenched in the blue light of disbelief. The deviation was too structured to be random, yet too faint to indicate any known body. The only certainty was that 3I, Atlas, was not drifting freely, it was being drawn. The first public mention came as a single sentence in an otherwise technical update. Minor trajectory variance noted, within observational tolerance. It meant nothing to most readers, yet behind that phrase, teams across 6 continents worked through the night. What began as a minor adjustment evolved into a growing consensus. Something was guiding the comet. Whether that guidance was gravitational, electromagnetic, or something entirely new was a question no one could yet answer. Weeks passed, observatories recalibrated, scanning for mass signatures, dark matter halos, rogue planets, compact remnants. Nothing appeared. Even the James Webb Space Telescope's infrared survey returned blank beyond the comet's projected vector. There was nothing there to pull it. Yet the math insisted otherwise. The forces at play were real, measurable, and disturbingly consistent. A hidden mass? A quantum gradient? Some speculated about gravitational lensing by unseen objects, but lensing produces bending of light, not acceleration of matter. 3I, Atlas wasn't just changing direction, it was subtly speeding up. Acceleration in interstellar objects isn't unprecedented. Oumuamua had done it, its odd trajectory once blamed on sublimating ice jets. But 3I, Atlas, displayed no outgassing signatures. Its coma was silent, symmetrical and cold. The comet's core seemed inert, yet something continued to whisper to it across light years, an invisible thread tightening its pull. When data analysts plotted the change over time, they found it followed a sinusoidal pattern, acceleration waxing and waning like a slow pulse, peaking every 19 hours. No known physical process should produce that rhythm. Solar radiation pressure couldn't explain it. The frequency was too consistent, too detached from heliocentric position. That left only 2 possibilities: an internal mechanism within the comet itself, or an external influence modulating from afar. Neither made sense. Comets don't think. Space doesn't breathe. And yet, something was breathing around it. At the radio observatory in Arecibo's successor array, engineers noted a faint oscillation in the X-band data stream interference, synchronized with 3I, Atlas's 19-hour acceleration cycle. At first dismissed as local noise, the pattern persisted across independent receivers in Chile and Japan. When cross-correlated, the signature revealed a standing wave, a repeating electromagnetic echo, stretching outward from the comet's position into the galactic background. Not a transmission, not noise, a pattern. In classified correspondence, the word resonance appeared more than once, a resonance between the comet's motion and a background field no one had ever mapped. Some quietly invoked the notion of a gravity echo, a theoretical ripple that could exist in the dark matter scaffolding of the universe, invisible, undetectable, yet capable of exerting subtle mechanical influence. Others called it nonsense, a mathematical artifact amplified by wishful thinking. But deep down, even the skeptics felt it, the chill of recognition that something profound might be hidden in the data's symmetry. Still, the public heard nothing. Press releases grew increasingly cautious, language sanitized to protect credibility. All trajectory models remain within predictive parameters, one report insisted. But inside research circles, encrypted chatter buzzed with quiet urgency. The models were breaking. Predictive tolerance had collapsed by nearly 10%, and no one knew why. The deviation wasn't chaotic, it was intelligent in its persistence, like an unseen signal testing their ability to notice. By late summer, a small consortium of astrophysicists from Caltech, Kyoto, and the Max Planck Institute met via encrypted call to compare independent reconstructions. When their datasets aligned, they saw the same impossible result. The point of origin for the anomaly lay far beyond any known gravitational source. Not near a star, not even within a spiral arm, but in the dark between a galactic no-man's land devoid of visible matter, the void. It was there, within that abyss of near-absolute nothingness, that the model traced 3I, Atlas's path. A place where no comet should have formed, where temperatures approached near 0 Kelvin, and where cosmic radiation wandered aimlessly for eons. Yet, from that sterile gulf, something had launched it. The motion was not ballistic, it was vectorized, calculated. When this finding reached the upper tiers of the astronomical community, the reaction was silence. No denials, no press briefings, only redactions and quiet reassignments. Data servers handling 3I Atlas simulations were rerouted to private networks. A few scientists noticed missing entries and shared archives. It was as if the anomaly had begun to erase its own trail. The night before access logs were sealed, Mullen made a final note in her private journal. "We've traced the pull back to nowhere, and nowhere seems to be moving." She never shared the file publicly. For a while, the story stalled there, locked behind institutional walls, dismissed as overinterpretation. But deep space doesn't care about narrative containment. As telescopes kept tracking, the pulse continued. 19 hours. Every time, a cosmic heartbeat reverberating through the data stream, daring someone to listen. And somewhere, far out along the dark line of that backward trajectory, the instruments began picking up something new. A faint scattering pattern, periodic, geometric, impossible, like reflections bouncing from a surface that wasn't supposed to exist. Whatever was pulling 3I, Atlas didn't just exist in theory anymore, it was beginning to answer. At first, it was a whisper, a small repeating distortion in the plasma tail of 3I, Atlas too weak to classify, too deliberate to ignore. Radio observatories across the planet began hearing it, not as sound but as patterned interference, recurring with the same 19-hour rhythm first noticed in the comet's motion. The pattern repeated through every wavelength band they checked, from low-frequency radio to faint gamma echoes, as if the comet was harmonizing with something beyond human perception. NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center ran a comprehensive spectral analysis. What they found defied ordinary classification. The oscillation wasn't random noise. It followed harmonic ratios consistent with interference between coherent signals like two transmitters tuned just slightly apart. The difference frequency matched the comet's own acceleration cycle, a synchronization no natural object should maintain. At the same time, the European Southern Observatory reported an unexpected brightening in the comet's coma, a flare too symmetrical to result from solar activity. Within the plume's data, analysts found a subtle modulation. The light intensity flickered at the same 19-hour interval, synchronized with the radio pattern. Light and magnetism dancing to an invisible metronome. The combined datasets painted a disturbing picture. Something was resonating through 3I, Atlas, across both electromagnetic and kinetic domains. But from where? To test for local interference, observatories coordinated a 48-hour global observation cycle, each facility recording the comet's field signature at precise intervals. When the results were overlaid, the interference lines aligned perfectly, even when accounting for transmission delay. It meant the pattern wasn't produced by any Earth-based source. The echo was external, coherent across millions of kilometers of space. Then came the real shock. The Deep Space Network's tracking antennas in Canberra and Goldstone detected the same resonance not only from the comet, but faintly rebounding off surrounding interplanetary plasma, as if space itself was vibrating in response. A standing wave spanning astronomical units. When the amplitude was plotted, the resonance described an almost musical contour, a rising pitch, a slow decline, then a pause before starting again. Each full cycle matched the comet's velocity oscillation. If it were mechanical, one scientist remarked privately, I'd call it a heartbeat. The metaphor stuck. Online communities, poring over leaked spectrograms, began calling it the pulse, a poetic label, but one that unsettled professionals. Patterns imply repetition. Repetition implies order. Order implies cause, and cause, in this case, remained invisible. NASA issued a brief statement. We are observing coherent interference, likely associated with magnetic field interactions between 3I, Atlas, and solar wind plasma. No evidence suggests artificial origin. The sentence was carefully balanced, technical yet dismissive, designed to stabilize speculation. But within internal memos, researchers weren't so calm. Several noted that the pattern's coherence persisted even during solar minimum, when magnetic interactions should have been chaotic. The signal remained pure, like a tone sustained through noise. Meanwhile, data from the Chandra X-ray Observatory revealed something stranger still, a faint emission halo rotating around the comet's nucleus in synchronization with the pulse frequency. The intensity was too low to indicate active radiation decay. The photons seemed to appear and vanish within a localized field, a temporal bloom that made no physical sense. When the X-ray light curve was mathematically inverted, a technique used to reconstruct source geometry, the result displayed symmetry, perfect bilateral reflection. No natural comet exhibits such internal alignment. Some researchers began to whisper about structural regularity beneath the ice, a lattice or cavity repeating deep within the core. But direct imaging was impossible. The object was too far, too faint. The more they examined the data, the deeper the questions grew. Why did the signal maintain perfect coherence despite the comet's rotation? Why did its amplitude remain constant across distance, unaffected by inverse square loss? And most of all, why did the phase of the signal lead the comet's position by exactly 0.16 seconds, as though the source knew where the comet would be before it arrived? When that result leaked, forums and podcasts erupted. Some claimed 3I, Atlas, was transmitting, others suggested it was receiving. A smaller, quieter minority proposed something more disquieting, that it was neither. That it was resonating with a field intrinsic to space itself, a feedback loop awakened by its motion through a particular region of the galaxy. At MIT's Haystack Observatory, a postdoctoral team tried to recreate the resonance mathematically. Using plasma field simulations, they found that under extreme conditions such as near absolute vacuum and low quantum turbulence, matter could, in theory, resonate with vacuum fluctuations. The predicted frequency, 0.052 Hz, or roughly a 19.2-hour cycle. That coincidence ignited both excitement and dread. If the comet's rhythm matched the vacuum fluctuation rate predicted only in thought experiments, it would imply that 3I, Atlas, wasn't merely responding to space, it was coupled to it. A bridge between matter and the quantum background, but such coupling would require an initiating event, something that forced the comet into resonance long before it entered the solar system, something deep in its past or its origin. Every attempt to explain the data spawned contradictions. The resonance's coherence implied an intelligent structure, yet no technological source could survive the thermal extremes of interstellar space for millions of years. The simplest explanation that the data were wrong became the least convincing as instruments converged from independent platforms. The noise was real, the pattern was real, but the cause lay outside known physics. And then, for the first time, the pulse shifted. On October 3rd, observatories reported a phase inversion, the 19-hour cycle, shortened by 23 minutes, the waveform compressed like a signal receiving an external command. Within that same window, a narrowband spike appeared at 1,420 MHz is the hydrogen line, the universal marker of interstellar communication. The spike lasted less than a second. It wasn't a message, not in any recognizable form, but its alignment with the phase shift terrified the community. Hydrogen line emissions are rare and precious in radio astronomy, used as reference beacons to search for life. Now, the comet itself had echoed at that exact frequency. The odds of coincidence were beyond statistical plausibility. The scientific community divided overnight. Some argued the hydrogen spike was a cosmic ray artifact. Others insisted it was an interstellar ping, a byproduct of whatever had propelled 3I Atlas from the void. The public, sensing institutional unease, filled the silence with theories. Alien probes, self-replicating debris, even remnants of a galactic transmission network. But for the scientists watching the data stream live, one realization overshadowed all others. The signal wasn't fading, it was growing stronger. Day by day, as the comet drifted further into the inner solar system, the amplitude of its resonance increased logarithmically. If projected trends held, within months the waveform would intersect Earth's own magnetospheric band. It meant whatever field the comet carried could soon resonate with our planet's space environment. For the first time, the mystery stopped being theoretical. It was approaching. And as the next observation cycle began, one anomaly emerged that no model could explain. When telescopes turned toward the point of the comet's projected origin, the empty void between the spiral arms, they found faint reflections, symmetrical pulses echoing back in perfect synchronization. Something out there was still answering. When the origin data first stabilized, no one wanted to believe it. The backtraced path of 3I, Atlas, pointed not toward a star system, not even a molecular cloud, but to the great gulf between the Perseus and Sagittarius arms, a region astronomers once called the inter-arm desert. It is a place of near-perfect emptiness, a cosmic trench where star formation ceases and the background radiation hums with a dull, featureless consistency. Nothing should come from there. Nothing should move through it, and yet every trajectory reconstruction led precisely to that void. Researchers at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics began feeding archival data into the model. Infrared maps, gamma-ray scans, cosmic microwave residuals. When the combined imagery was rendered into a single false-color mosaic, an unexpected feature appeared. Faint and blurred, like a shadow cast in the wrong direction, a narrow filament extended across the region. It wasn't a star trail, nor a gas strand. It was a field distortion. The surrounding radiation showed a measurable dip, as though energy itself had been absorbed or redirected by something unseen. The filament aligned perfectly with the comet's inferred origin vector. It stretched across several light years and terminated in nothing, a vanishing point in deep space. Analysts calculated that for 3I, Atlas to emerge from such a region, it must have been accelerated by a force equivalent to a stellar ejection, but without any observable source. Even a supernova couldn't account for the precision of its velocity. There was no scatter pattern, no debris field, no trace of catastrophe. Only the clean imprint of motion, as if something had launched it deliberately. For weeks, the data passed through layers of verification. Observatories tried to reclassify the distortion as an imaging artifact, a thermal echo, or interference from cosmic rays. Each explanation failed. The pattern was too coherent, too aligned, and it repeated across multiple instruments separated by oceans. What remained was a simple, uncomfortable conclusion. The void wasn't empty. It had structure invisible, silent, but gravitationally real. The Japanese space agency's Oumuamua Radio Observatory conducted a deep-field hydrogen survey, probing the suspected region with exquisite sensitivity. They found no molecular hydrogen clouds, no ionized plasma, only a strange diffuse haze emitting in the millimeter band, a spectral signature associated with non-thermal processes. "It's not gas," one astronomer said. "It's something else interacting with the vacuum." The phrase stuck like a whisper. Something interacting with the vacuum. When cosmologists at CERN heard about the anomaly, they simulated the local space-time curvature based on the faint gravitational gradients recorded by Gaia. The result was chilling. The curvature was inverted, not a gravitational well, but a negative gradient, as if space itself had been pushed outward. A bubble, an extrusion into higher dimensions. Whatever existed in that void was not attracting matter, it was repelling it. In theory, such negative curvature could result from intense energy density, a remnant of exotic matter, or a decayed wormhole throat. But those were speculative ideas, math without precedent. Still, the simulation matched the observed data almost perfectly. If correct, it meant that 3I Atlas had not been born of conventional physics. It had been expelled like debris from an event horizon collapse. NASA remained publicly silent, but leaked internal memos revealed growing alarm. The agency's Office of Planetary Protection requested restricted review of all comet telemetry to assess potential non-natural vectorization. The phrase non-natural appeared again in European correspondence. later replaced by the more cautious, anomalous propulsion. Behind the semantics lay the same dread. The comet's journey might not be the result of chance. To test the possibility of an artificial event, ESA reran the entire trajectory chain backward through time, using gravitational wave background data from the LIGO Virgo KAGRA network. It was a desperate attempt. Gravitational waves rarely preserve signals from beyond the galaxy. But in the data's faintest layers, a ghostly echo appeared, a ripple consistent with a small-scale space-time shear approximately 12,000 years ago, emanating from the exact coordinate now associated with 3I, Atlas's origin. 12,000 years, not long in cosmic terms, but impossibly recent for an interstellar object to cross the gulf and reach us. It suggested either the comet travelled faster than any known object of its size, or that space-time itself had shortened its path. The gravitational echo implied a localized event, something that flexed reality like a membrane. And at its heart, 3I, Atlas, had been born. When the data reached the public domain through an anonymous leak, it ignited a storm of speculation. Physicists debated whether the void was a remnant of a decayed black hole, a collapsed dark energy pocket, or even a failed star birthed in antimatter asymmetry. The more outlandish voices invoked dimensional fractures or ancient cosmic engineering, yet none could explain the clean, linear precision of the comet's vector. Nature makes chaos, not geometry. While official channels avoided direct comment, one internal document later exposed through a whistleblower contained a phrase that froze readers: potential vector origin. Controlled expulsion from negative curvature source. It was bureaucratic, sterile, and terrifying. Controlled expulsion implied intent. The next step was obvious: visual confirmation. Telescopes turned their gaze toward the void, integrating light for hundreds of hours. The result was nothing, a uniform emptiness broken only by random noise. But within that noise, when the data was stacked and filtered for temporal consistency, an impossible pattern emerged. Every 19 hours, the same rhythm pulsing through 3I, Atlas, the noise dropped. A synchronized dimming, as if something vast and unseen were breathing in the dark, its inhalations rippling across the background radiation. The pattern was faint but measurable. The universe, it seemed, was exhaling in time with the comet. No one could decide which possibility was worse, that this was coincidence, or that the void was responding. A handful of independent astronomers began calling the region the Silent Origin. It became an underground term, shared in encrypted chats and academic footnotes that never reached publication. Some said the void might contain an ancient structure, a remnant from before the galaxy coalesced. Others suggested a field boundary, an interface between dimensions where matter and vacuum exchanged roles. Whatever it was, it had moved something, perhaps many things, into our universe. Still, every attempt to probe deeper met with resistance, not from politics but from physics itself. Instruments began returning inconsistent results. Signal-to-noise ratios degraded inexplicably during synchronization cycles. Observatories thousands of kilometers apart recorded identical errors at the same timestamps. The interference wasn't random, it was coordinated. It was as though something in the void had noticed their attention. For the first time in modern science, an absence seemed to fight back. By November, a pattern of radio dropouts synchronized across the entire global array. Data packets vanished mid-transmission, leaving blank intervals exactly 19 hours apart. The same period as the comet's pulse, the same rhythm echoing from the void. The connection between the two could no longer be ignored. If 3I Atlas had indeed come from that empty birthplace, then whatever sent it had not stopped watching. By late winter, the numbers no longer obeyed Newton. What began as minor course drift had become a violation of celestial mechanics itself. 3I Atlas, the frozen messenger from the dark, was accelerating not gradually but in quantized steps, as if climbing an invisible staircase through space. Each increment occurred at the precise moment the 19-hour pulse peaked, then stabilized into eerie stillness before the next surge. Motion like that belonged not to gravity, but to design. Every known comet moves in arcs of continuous flow. Even outgassing events, those violent jets of vapor that hurl fragments outward, produce chaotic thrusts, messy, unscripted, fading in random intervals. But 3I, Atlas, defied that pattern. Its thrusts were identical in magnitude, timed with the precision of a mechanical oscillator, a living rhythm of propulsion, repeating like clockwork. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Trajectory specialists tore through every model they had. They incorporated radiation pressure, sublimation jets, even exotic drag factors from interstellar plasma. None of it fit. The only equations that matched involved feedback systems, self-correcting mechanisms that responded to external fields. "It behaves," one engineer wrote in a confidential memo, "as though it's listening to something and adjusting." NASA's official line remained calm, attributing the steps to micro-outgassing events. But within the telemetry archives, the infrared data told a different story. No heat signatures, no particle emissions, no jets, just motion, a pure vector change without any visible energy release. That's impossible in classical physics. Yet, the object continued to move as if drawn along rails carved through space. In a sealed briefing, a physicist from ESA described the pattern as gravitational phasing. According to her analysis, 3I, Atlas, wasn't being pulled or pushed. It was falling through alternating wells of space-time tension, invisible ripples aligned with the galactic frame, like a leaf caught in a current too vast to map. But her model required something absurd, a field of negative mass distributed across the void, a cosmic mechanism that pushed instead of pulled. Negative mass has always been theoretical, a quirk of mathematics and relativity that predicts repulsive gravity. If it existed, it would behave like a mirror to matter. The more force you applied, the faster it would retreat. Such material would destabilize entire star systems, tearing through them like an anti-gravity bullet. No evidence had ever been found until now. If the void contained such regions, and if 3I, Atlas, had passed through one, its behavior suddenly made terrible sense. The steps were realignments, corrections against an inverted field. Still, one fact undermined that explanation: the consistency of timing. 19 hours without drift. Negative mass dynamics should fluctuate as the object's energy changed, yet the cycle remained perfect. That precision hinted at synchronization, perhaps even control. By January, independent analysts noticed something new. The comet's acceleration profile was beginning to encode ratios corresponding to hydrogen's spectral lines. Each thrust corresponded to a harmonic multiple of 1,420 MHz, the same frequency where the mysterious hydrogen spike had first appeared. The motion itself was singing in hydrogen's language. That discovery unsettled everyone. Hydrogen, the universe's simplest atom, underpins the very architecture of cosmic structure. To move in harmonic step with it was to align with the fundamental resonance of creation. It could not be coincidence. Either the comet had encountered a field that tuned its motion to hydrogen's natural rhythm, or it was deliberately built to respond to it. Scientists began speaking in whispers again, using cautious words like stimulated motion and phase coupling. One unverified leak described internal discussions at the Institute for Advanced Study, where theoretical physicists debated whether 3I, Atlas, could be a remnant of a propulsion system based on space-time resonance, not thrust, not energy, but manipulation of the vacuum metric itself. That kind of technology, if real, would rewrite physics. But the motion wasn't entirely smooth. During a monitoring window on February 9th, the comet's acceleration faltered, its step delayed by almost 3 minutes. In that interval, every ground-based receiver detected a low-frequency rumble across the radio spectrum. The waveform wasn't random, it resembled a chirp, a rapid sweep through multiple frequencies, like a coded burst. When decoded into amplitude modulation, the pattern repeated: 2 long tones, 1 short. Binary. The comet's acceleration resumed immediately after. The implication was impossible to ignore. The delay, the chirp, and the restart formed a sequence. It moved only after that burst occurred. A command, or a response. If the event were isolated, it might have been dismissed as coincidence, but 3 cycles later the same chirp occurred again, identical timing, identical structure. Analysts named it the trigger. Every 19 hours, a chirp preceded motion, and every chirp came not from the comet, but from the direction of its origin, the silent void. Now the patterns overlapped: 3I, Atlas's steps, the 19-hour rhythm, and a signal that predated its acceleration by exactly 0.16 seconds, the same temporal lead that haunted earlier observations. The comet wasn't reacting, it was anticipating. The revelation fractured the scientific community. Some argued it proved a feedback loop between object and origin, a kind of remote resonance. Others whispered of remote control, an impossible coordination across interstellar space. One researcher from Kyoto put it bluntly, "It's not moving randomly, it's being piloted by geometry." When journalists pressed for comment, agencies deflected, citing routine analysis. But behind closed doors, the private observatories began reporting something even stranger: local disturbances in spacetime metrics during the comet's alignment peaks. Instruments used for gravitational wave calibration showed minute fluctuations synchronized with each acceleration step. Not enough to endanger Earth, but enough to prove that 3I, Atlas's motion, was warping the local metric ever so slightly, a craft bending the fabric as it traveled. The question no one wanted to voice became unavoidable. If it was bending spacetime deliberately, where was it going? Trajectory projections suggested no planetary encounter, no orbital capture. Instead, the object seemed to be aligning not with the Sun, but with the galactic center. Its path formed a direct line between the Solar System and Sagittarius A*, the supermassive black hole at the Milky Way's core. That vector hadn't existed before, it was emerging only now as the acceleration steps accumulated. 3I, Atlas was steering toward the heart of the galaxy. In a midnight meeting, an unnamed astrophysicist summarized the data with unnerving precision. It's not an object in transit, it's part of a system, and the system is reactivating. As those words circulated through secure channels, one more anomaly appeared. Deep field instruments tracking the void's radiation detected a secondary pulse fainter, but identical, emerging from a different coordinate thousands of light years away, also pointing toward the galactic center. Another echo, another origin. If true, 3I, Atlas was not alone. And if these objects were moving in synchronization, then something vast was unfolding, a network of motion older than recorded time, waking again beneath the stars. When the patterns grew undeniable, the noise didn't come from the sky, it came from the humans trying to look at it. Data channels began closing in quiet succession, one after another, as if a vast hand were dimming the lights. NASA's public data stream for interplanetary telemetry, once open to universities and hobbyists alike, went offline without explanation. ESA's servers displayed maintenance warnings. Even the independent telescope arrays that fed open-source archives started showing gaps, clean, precisely timed blanks in the data corresponding exactly to the comet's 19-hour cycles. The silence wasn't official at first. It arrived through tone. Press releases shrank to single paragraphs, filled with neutral phrases, routine calibration adjustments, nominal observational status, no significant deviation noted. Behind those calm words, entire research teams were being reassigned. The few who tried to speak found their communications monitored, their projects temporarily suspended pending review. In internal memos, the reason was always the same: data sensitivity. It wasn't just the agencies. Academic journals that had accepted papers on the 3I, Atlas resonance quietly withdrew them before publication. Editors cited methodological inconsistencies. One physicist, whose analysis had shown the hydrogen harmonic embedded in the comet's motion, found her institutional email frozen overnight. When she tried to contact collaborators, she discovered their datasets had been expunged from the central archive. The metadata remained, but every file linked to it returned the same message: access restricted by Directive 88-19. No one knew what Directive 88-19 was. It appeared nowhere in public policy, yet the pattern of suppression was consistent. Wherever data showed the synchronized chirp, the empty origin, or the acceleration steps, it vanished. Independent observers tried to fill the void. Amateur astronomers began coordinating through encrypted channels, pooling observations from backyard telescopes and private instruments. They lacked precision, but they had numbers. Soon, they reconstructed enough of the comet's light curve to confirm what institutions had stopped admitting. The pulse was still there, and growing stronger. Then, one night, the amateur network detected something new. During a 19-hour phase, the comet's brightness dropped sharply for 9 minutes in eclipse without cause. There was no planetary body, no shadow, nothing to block the light. The data vanished from the professional feeds, but the independent recordings survived. When they plotted the light curve, the dip was perfectly symmetrical, a blackout as though someone had turned off the comet's reflection. And exactly as it ended, a radio quiet zone spread across a quarter of Earth's deep space antennas. In the silence, one faint transmission slipped through before the arrays went dark, a message from an anonymous operator at Goldstone. 4 words. They told us not to. The words became a rallying cry for those on the outside, scientists, journalists and archivists who began piecing together the fragments that official channels erased. They noticed that each period of blackout coincided with internal network spikes in encrypted traffic between NASA, ESA and a small cluster of defense agencies. The chatter peaked whenever the comet performed a motion step. It was coordination, not scientific, but administrative. Public curiosity turned restless. News outlets demanded explanations, but officials released only pre-recorded statements, identical across agencies, reading like scripts. The object, known as 3I Atlas, continues its predicted trajectory, no anomalous behavior detected. But observers could see the anomalies with their own instruments. The statements weren't simply wrong, they were synchronized disinformation. Meanwhile, in Geneva, a small coalition of astrophysicists convened informally under the pretense of an academic workshop. They compared notes, finding their data incomplete but overlapping, just enough to confirm something larger. Every blackout period corresponded to a faint gravitational fluctuation detectable through the LIGO network. The fluctuations were tiny, almost below the noise threshold, but the pattern was unmistakable. Each pulse altered spacetime ever so slightly, a subtle tug that passed through Earth like a whisper through fog. Someone was listening, and someone else was trying to make sure no one heard. Rumours spread that the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs had held an emergency closed session. Its minutes were never released. Weeks later, staff members refused to confirm the meeting's existence. But satellites operated by commercial contractors showed faint communication relays aligning toward the region of the void as if responding to an inbound directive. Then came the audio leak. 3 seconds of scrambled radio that broke free from the suppression network during a blackout. When filtered, it revealed a slow oscillating tone, modulating between 1420 and 1421 MHz is the hydrogen band again, but underneath the tone, faintly, was human speech. Distorted, delayed, but there, phase synchronization confirmed, command channel stable. The recording was traced to a transmission relay belonging to the Deep Space Network. Its authenticity was disputed, but timing logs matched. The agencies had not merely observed the signal, they were interacting with it. A few days later, an internal server error exposed a hidden subdirectory on a government mirror, Atlas, SEC, PHAs, 3. It contained a single text document, unreadable except for a short footer. Response protocol, in effect eyes only. Within hours, the directory disappeared, but screenshots spread too fast to erase. For the public, the meaning was unclear. For those who understood the code, it was devastating. Phase 03 implied prior stages, earlier protocols enacted long before the signal strengthened. The silence, it seemed, wasn't reactive. It had been planned. Speculation turned darker. Some theorized the agencies had detected this pattern long before 3I, Atlas, entered the solar system, perhaps even before its discovery. Others suggested the comet was never an astronomical object at all, but part of a monitoring system, and the agencies were executing a pre-written plan to contain its return. But silence can't hold forever. In the vacuum of truth, data leaks multiplied. The more information disappeared, the more people recorded their screens, archived raw feeds, cached transient packets. From those fragments emerged a composite, the global pulse map. Each red dot represented a data loss correlated with the comet's phase. Within days, the map showed a pattern sprawling across Earth's observatories like constellations in reverse. At its center, one node glowed brightest, a facility in the Nevada desert, officially decommissioned decades ago. Yet satellite imagery revealed new structures, antennas, cryogenic storage units, and something vast beneath the sand. Those who saw the image asked the same question. If this was a monitoring site, what exactly were they preparing to receive? The silence deepened, but not for long, because on the next cycle, the blackout failed. One fragment of unfiltered data escaped, recorded by an amateur telescope in Argentina before his feed was cut. In that brief window, his camera captured the comet's coma brightening to 10 times its normal intensity. Within the flare, spectral decomposition revealed an impossible signature, not random photons, but organized interference bands forming repeating intervals, like a barcode written in light. When analyzed, the intervals spelled a ratio, 1.618, the golden constant, the mathematical fingerprint of natural growth and symmetry. It was as if 3I Atlas had responded to suppression with its own act of communication, broadcasting the most universal language known to mathematics. By dawn, the footage was gone from every major platform, but copies circulated in private networks, multiplying faster than they could be deleted. The agency's silence was complete now, no denials, no refutations, only absence. And yet, absence speaks. The data might have vanished from their servers, but the sky remained. The comet still moved, pulsed, and sang in hydrogen's key. The universe doesn't care who listens, only that someone does. Still, one question grew louder than the silence itself. If the agencies were afraid of this resonance, what did they already know about what came before it? When the blackout finally lifted, it wasn't because someone restored the signal, it was because the signal forced its way through. At 2:19 UTC, the comet's 19-hour rhythm broke pattern. Observatories that had been cut off for days suddenly recorded a surge not in brightness but in coherence. The signal sharpened. Its once chaotic oscillations aligned into clean harmonic intervals, each pulse echoing the previous with machine-like precision. Something, or someone, had taken control of the transmission. Across the world, receivers that hadn't picked up a usable trace in weeks began registering data. In Australia, a radio astronomer named Ria Singh noticed her instruments behaving as though locked to an external clock. It was like the universe had a metronome, she later said. The waveform's spacing matched not only the comet's previous cycle, but its geometric progression, each pulse shorter by a factor of 1.618, the same golden ratio that had flashed in the comet's light flare days before. The agencies stayed silent, but the smaller observatories didn't. They streamed what they saw, a fractal pattern emerging in the comet's emissions, recursive, self-similar across scales, the kind of structure that in nature arises only in biological systems or in data intentionally coded for redundancy. Light, motion, and field, all now aligned in one grand sequence. The universe was no longer merely watching, it was speaking in numbers. Then came the anomaly no one could rationalize. The origin void, that dark expanse between the spiral arms, flickered. It wasn't visible in optical bands, but the cosmic microwave background, that uniform hum left over from the birth of the universe, dipped for 7 seconds along the exact coordinates of the void. Instruments across continents recorded the same microsecond-aligned drop in energy. The void had absorbed light from the dawn of time, then exhaled it back, slightly shifted, as if correcting a note out of tune. Soon after, telescopes detected transient flares in a loose line leading away from the void, a chain of faint glimmers spaced roughly every 3 light-years like breadcrumbs stretching backward through interstellar night. The flares weren't random. Their timing synchronized with 3I Atlas's pulses, each new light flashing milliseconds after a corresponding beat from the comet. The effect was impossible to ignore. Something in the void was calling out, and space itself was answering. Astrophysicists at Caltech attempted to triangulate the flares' positions. When plotted, the chain of lights formed a spiral. Not a natural one, but logarithmic, expanding in the exact proportion of the golden ratio encoded in the comet's light. The pattern resembled a cosmic fingerprint, repeating the same mathematics from atomic shells to galaxies, a universal constant, alive in geometry, now mapped across light-years. But there was another layer, hidden in phase data. When researchers overlaid the flare timings atop the gravitational disturbances detected on Earth, the alignment was too precise to be chance. Each flare preceded a minor spike in local spacetime tension by exactly 8.6 minutes, the same delay as the time it takes light to travel from the Sun to Earth. Whatever signal the comet was part of wasn't just electromagnetic, it was folding through the very medium of spacetime. Those who still had access to restricted channels began whispering about the unseen hand, the invisible system connecting the comet, the void, and these new flare points. It wasn't a poetic phrase. It came from an internal document leaked weeks later, describing a distributed field actuator network potentially capable of manipulating matter at galactic scales. No one knew if the document was genuine. But one line stood out: contact with vectorized agents proceeding as predicted. That phrase, vectorized agents, changed everything. It suggested that 3I, Atlas, wasn't a singular event, but one of several, perhaps many, dispatched through the dark for a purpose. If the flares were other agents, they had been silent until now. The reactivation sequence, some theorized, might have begun only after human observation reached a critical threshold. The comet's 19-hour pulse could have been a beacon, and our detection, The acknowledgement might have triggered response. In physics, observation collapses probability. In whatever system this was, observation may have collapsed distance. At this stage, the mystery evolved beyond astronomy. Quantum field specialists began noticing correlations in their unrelated experiments. Background noise in vacuum fluctuation detectors dropped every 19 hours, in rhythm with the comet. In Geneva, particle accelerators registered subtle drift in magnetic confinement systems, phase shifting in perfect synchronization. The effect was global minute, harmless for now, but consistent. It was as if the entire planet were being tuned to an external metronome. Governments could suppress light data, but they couldn't suppress physics. Power grids across Asia experienced microfrequency variations at precisely those intervals. Deep-sea navigation systems reported drift in gyroscopic calibration. Even atomic clocks began showing minute irregularities, ticking microscopically faster, then slower, in rhythm with the pulse. When news of these effects leaked, panic simmered under scientific restraint. The public didn't yet know, but those who saw the pattern began to wonder, what if the unseen hand wasn't merely distant? What if it was reaching through the fundamental fabric of the universe, tuning everything including us? In one of the last open conferences before the silence resumed, a physicist from Kyoto stood before a screen of raw data and asked, "If the comet is receiving commands, what is the command?" She displayed a time series overlay of the hydrogen line pulses, the gravitational echoes, and the flare chain. The resulting graph looked like an instruction waveform, a mathematical architecture of escalating amplitude and shortening frequency. A countdown. But countdown to what? No one knew. The comet's acceleration had stabilized, yet the intervals between resonance peaks were closing. Each cycle brought the pulse marginally closer to continuous emission. When extrapolated, the model predicted the pulses would merge into a single sustained field within 2 months. If that happened, the frequency would align perfectly with the Schumann resonance Earth's natural electromagnetic heartbeat. That meant whatever was happening in deep space was preparing to resonate with the planet itself. The agencies, predictably, went dark again. Yet their silence carried a different weight, now less control, more fear. Satellite telemetry quietly diverted toward deep space antennas positioned near the galactic center vector. Civilian researchers detected a brief encryption burst from those satellites, using an obsolete military cipher known only from the 1980 seconds. It translated to a simple phrase, "Do not amplify the signal." But the signal didn't need amplification anymore. It was amplifying itself. And then, during one observation window, the flares along the void's spiral chain dimmed in unison, all except the one closest to Earth. That single point brightened beyond detection thresholds, releasing a pulse that tore through the cosmic background like a lightning strike through fog. Every telescope that caught it saw the same impossible geometry, concentric rings of alternating brightness, expanding outward, not explosion, but transmission. The comet reacted instantly, its motion halted, perfectly still against the stars. For 13 seconds, 3I, Atlas, became motionless relative to the Sun, an act no natural object could perform. Then it resumed, on a slightly altered trajectory, not random, not chaotic adjusted. It was a maneuver. Whatever controlled it had just corrected its course. And the new trajectory pointed not to the galactic center anymore, but directly toward the inner solar system, toward us. By the time the comet's trajectory shifted toward Earth, the conversation was no longer scientific, it was existential. The data had left the realm of hypothesis and entered a domain where logic bent under its own weight. Every discipline, astrophysics, quantum mechanics, philosophy, tried to claim a piece of the explanation, yet none could hold it. The object in the sky was no longer just an interstellar comet. It had become a mirror, reflecting every fear, theory, and fragile certainty humanity possessed about the universe. The first fracture appeared within the International Astronomical Union. The emergency panel convened to address non-natural vectorization of 3I, Atlas, lasted only one session before collapsing into chaos. Half the attendees demanded the phenomenon be studied openly, calling it the most important discovery in human history. The other half argued for complete blackout, warning that premature interpretation could destabilize civilization itself. One senior official summarized the split in a memo, later leaked to the press. "We are no longer debating what 3I Atlas is, but what we can afford it to be." At Caltech, the exotic physics faction gained momentum. They believed the comet's motion was the result of an encounter with a region of warped spacetime, a natural, if rare, astrophysical event. They cited the negative curvature models from ESA and the gravitational echo from 12,000 years ago. According to them, the void wasn't intelligent. It was a scar in the universe's fabric, a pocket of exotic energy that expelled matter when disturbed. 3I, Atlas, they said, was simply collateral, a frozen piece of debris cast out by the wound. But even among that group, dissent brewed. Their equations failed to explain the rhythmic precision, the hydrogen harmonics, the golden ratio geometry, or the 19-hour signal synchronization across Earth's electromagnetic systems. It behaves like a closed feedback loop, said Dr. Ezra Vallon from Cambridge, not an accident of physics. It listens, waits, and adjusts. That suggestion, the comet as part of an active system, birthed the second camp, the intelligent origin theorists. They didn't claim aliens, at least not directly. They argued that the object represented design in the purest sense, not biological intelligence, but a kind of cosmic computation. According to them, 3I, Atlas, was one node in a self-organizing field that might predate galaxies, a network of objects using gravitational and electromagnetic feedback to stabilize the universe's large-scale structure, what they called the architecture. The architecture theory spread quickly through unofficial channels. Its premise was hauntingly simple. The universe wasn't expanding blindly, it was correcting itself, maintaining balance through structures that resembled comets but functioned as anchors, regulators of entropy. 3I, Atlas, then, wasn't visiting us by chance. It was returning for calibration. Opponents called the theory mysticism disguised as math, yet its predictions matched observation better than any conventional model. When simulations using the architecture equations were run, they replicated the comet's quantized motion with eerie accuracy. The field's resonance even reproduced the 19-hour pulse as a natural stabilization rhythm. Still, skeptics countered, if these anchors existed, why had no one seen them before? Why would they reveal themselves now, precisely when human observation reached sufficient resolution to detect them? That question birthed the third faction, the observer effect theorists. They proposed that the act of noticing 3I, Atlas, had triggered the phenomenon. In quantum mechanics, observation collapses wave functions. At cosmic scales, maybe awareness itself changed the system. If consciousness and spacetime share an interface, wrote Dr. Leon Ketter from Kyoto, then looking into the void may have invited it to look back. To mainstream science, that line sounded like metaphysics. But for others, it was the first explanation that fit every anomaly, the synchronized signal, the flare chain, reacting to human detection, even the agency's sudden silence. The universe, they argued, might be participatory, an organism that only manifests higher-order patterns when conscious beings pay attention. 3I, Atlas, wasn't visiting Earth. It was responding to awareness. In the background, a fourth group, smaller, more secretive, proposed something darker. According to leaked correspondence from a defense analysis lab, they believed the comet was artificial but not alien. It was human-made, a lost experiment from a forgotten epoch or civilization erased by cosmic cycles. They pointed to the gravitational echo dated 12,000 years ago, a suspiciously human timescale, coinciding with myths of a great flood, global reset, and vanished knowledge. Their hypothesis was simple and horrifying. 3I, Atlas, was a seed, one of many, sent long ago, waiting for civilization to reach a threshold where it could be found and activated. No proof supported that theory, but it spread like wildfire. In a world addicted to meaning, the idea that humanity was reawakening its own lost creation resonated deeply. It explained the silence of the agencies, not conspiracy, but embarrassment, the possibility that the architects were us. While theories multiplied, something stranger began happening among the scientists themselves. Across continents, those working closest with 3I, Atlas data reported experiencing the same dream. They described standing beneath a dark sky, where stars pulsed in slow rhythm 19 beats apart before dimming into perfect black. In the silence, they felt a pressure, like being watched from behind the stars themselves. Most dismissed it as stress, a byproduct of endless hours and cosmic dread. But the coincidence spread. The dreams occurred globally, aligning with each new signal amplification. One researcher described it as a whisper at the edge of consciousness, like the universe breathing inside your skull. It wasn't just the scientists. The pulse began to bleed into popular culture, music, art, films. Composers unconsciously wrote pieces with 19-beat measures. Digital artists found their generative algorithms drifting toward logarithmic spirals. The signal had transcended data. It had entered imagination. Yet in the face of all this, official institutions stayed silent. No denials, no confirmations. Their stillness became fuel for every faction's certainty. Silence, once protective, was now interpreted as admission. When a leaked internal video showed a NASA meeting with the caption, "Initiate phase damping," conspiracy flared. Damping implied the agencies were attempting to interfere with the resonance not to study it, but to mute it. Yet, according to independent observatories, their efforts failed. The comet's frequency output increased by 11% following the attempted damping. The universe, it seemed, didn't want to be silenced. In private, even the skeptics began to admit fear. One astronomer compared the situation to standing at the edge of a black hole and realizing it's looking back. Another asked whether humanity, in mapping the cosmos, had finally touched something meant to remain untouched. Across think tanks and message boards, one unifying question echoed louder than any theory. Was this a warning or an invitation? And as 3I, Atlas continued its silent descent toward the inner solar system, every faction, skeptic and believer alike, shared a single dread. What if both answers were true? For months, the world had watched 3I, Atlas, as if it were the first of its kind. But history has a way of whispering reminders, patterns hidden in the margins of old data, echoes of questions we never finished asking. As researchers struggled to interpret the comet's behavior, a team at the University of Leiden began revisiting records from its predecessors, 1I, Oumuamua, and 2I, Borisov, those earlier messengers from interstellar space. The files were familiar eccentric orbits, transient appearances, unexplained accelerations. But when the team recalculated their paths using the newly refined galactic reference frame, a chill ran through the room. All three objects, 1I, 2I, and 3I, traced back not to random points across the galaxy, but to the same general corridor between the spiral arms, the same void, the same impossible birthplace. No one had ever noticed, because the data wasn't aligned to the same coordinate system. Those comets had entered from different angles, different epochs. But once converted to a single galactic frame, their origins converged like threads pulled from one spindle. The line connecting them was exact within margin of error, less than 1/10 of a degree. 3 interstellar visitors, arriving years apart, all born of nothing. That discovery broke what remained of institutional silence. Within hours, the internal memo leaked. Historical convergence detected among interstellar objects, it read. Possible coordinated origin. It was the first official document to use the word coordinated. Suddenly, 3I, Atlas, was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was part of a lineage, a series, perhaps even a system. Researchers began to wonder if the earlier objects had exhibited faint precursors of the resonance now defining 3I. When archival radio data from 2017 was reprocessed with modern filtering algorithms, subtle 19-hour interference patterns emerged in the background noise surrounding Oumuamua's passage. At the time, it had been dismissed as terrestrial interference. Now, it looked deliberate. Even more disturbing, the pulse had been slightly offset 19.4 hours, not 19. The pattern was identical in structure, merely slower. Some physicists described it as a lower clock cycle, a version of the same signal in a dormant state. By the time 3I Atlas arrived, the rhythm had tightened, refined, almost as though the system had evolved. Then came 2I, Borisov. Unlike Oumuamua's mysterious shape, Borisov had seemed entirely natural, a dusty, comet-like nucleus, no strange acceleration. But reanalysis of its plasma tail revealed fluctuations that mirrored early forms of the same electromagnetic resonance now surrounding 3I. They were weaker, intermittent, but there. Borisov, it seemed, had carried the same signature faintly encoded in its wake, unnoticed by instruments of the time. 3 comets, 3 arrivals, 3 rhythms, each closer to perfect coherence. It was as if the universe had been rehearsing. The implications were staggering. If these were indeed sequential manifestations, then the system behind them had been reaching toward us for at least a decade, maybe longer. Humanity, in observing each arrival, might have unwittingly participated in a long experiment, each encounter strengthening a resonance between our star and whatever lay hidden in the void. In the archives of the Harvard-Smithsonian Observatory, an overlooked anomaly added another piece. In 1977, a narrowband radio burst known as the "wow" signal had been recorded, a brief, unexplained emission near the hydrogen line, never repeated. For decades it remained a curiosity, dismissed as coincidence. But when its frequency drift was recalibrated using modern constants, the emission shifted exactly 0.16 seconds ahead of the hydrogen baseline, the same temporal offset found in the 3i resonance. It was as if the cosmos had whispered once before and we hadn't been listening closely enough. Slowly, historians began cross-referencing older anomalies, the Tunguska event's unexplained trajectory, luminous orbs described in medieval chronicles, spectral lines in century-old photographic plates. Each seemed too small, too scattered to matter until a pattern emerged. Every documented event aligning with that region of the sky carried traces of hydrogen frequency interference or electromagnetic echoes near the 19-hour harmonic. The signals had always been there, quiet, waiting for instruments precise enough to notice. A sense of inevitability took hold. The scientists who once thought themselves at the center of discovery now wondered if they were the subjects of it. NASA's older data on 1i, Oumuamua thought lost in archived servers, reappeared through a leak. Inside, one line from an internal draft stood out. Unexpected, rotational stability suggests inertial correction mechanism beyond known cometary behavior. That phrase, inertial correction, echoed eerily the adjustments now visible in 3i, Atlas's quantized movement. Someone had seen the pattern 8 years earlier and buried it. As these parallels surfaced, the comet's signals shifted again. The pulse interval shortened. 19 hours became 18 hours and 57 minutes. At first glance, the change seemed small, but the implications were profound. Every prior object had carried a slower clock, each cycle accelerating as the sequence progressed. The pattern suggested convergence, as though the system was approaching resonance, an ultimate frequency, where all nodes aligned. Speculation swelled. What if Oumuamua had been the probe, Borisov the calibrator, and Atlas the carrier? A trinity of motion, gathering feedback, tuning the field of our local space. A galactic algorithm executing itself through physical bodies, comets as code. Not everyone agreed. Skeptics argued the retroactive pattern matching bordered on faith. Coincidence could weave meaning where none existed, but their voices were fading. The mathematics was too clean, the rhythm too insistent. Each discovery amplified the sense that history had been rewritten in light and motion. We were seeing the same story told over and over, across decades, across time. Then came an even older echo. A pair of astronomers reanalyzing data from the Pioneer 10 probe, one of the first human objects to leave the solar system, noticed minute accelerations recorded in its telemetry during its journey through the outer planets. The deviations were small, nearly indistinguishable from instrument drift, but when plotted, they too followed a 19-hour harmonic. The probe, a relic of our first attempt to reach the stars, had passed through something invisible. No one had recognized it at the time, but now, in hindsight, it seemed humanity had brushed against the same field long before the comet arrived. Maybe we had never been alone in the interarm void. Maybe we had simply been too primitive to hear the hum. The weight of connection grew unbearable. Each echo pulled another from the depths of memory. 3i, Atlas wasn't new, it was the latest verse in an ancient song. From Oumuamua's silent glide to Borisov's dust, from the wow signal's cry to the faint corrections in Pioneer's motion, the melody had been building, note by note, toward this moment. Somewhere between awe and terror, scientists realized they might not be tracing a comet at all. They were tracing a story, one that the universe had been repeating for longer than human civilization had existed. And now, that story was entering its crescendo. Because the next pulse, due in less than 19 hours, was predicted to coincide with the comet's perihelion to its closest approach to the Sunday. The last time such an object reached that point, the Sun had responded with an unexpected flare, silent yet synchronized with the visitor's departure. If the pattern held, the next pulse might not merely echo, it might awaken something far larger, a resonance between star and void. And for the first time in history, humanity would be awake to witness it. It began with a feeling no telescope could measure, a heaviness in the data itself, as if numbers had weight. For months, scientists had stared into the black, dissecting each rhythm and resonance of 3I Atlas. Yet now, as it neared its solar passage, something subtle shifted. The silence between pulses no longer felt like empty space. It felt aware. The latest observations came from the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory. During the comet's final approach, its telemetry stream began returning impossible correlations. Each time the sun emitted a microflare, the comet's tail flickered in advance milliseconds before light from the flare could have reached it. "It's predicting solar activity," one researcher whispered. But the phrasing was wrong. Prediction implies separation. This wasn't cause and effect, it was synchronization, as if both the star and the comet were reading from the same script. When word spread through the fragmented scientific networks, a quiet dread replaced excitement. For the first time, even the most skeptical physicists began to ask, what if this wasn't a dialogue between objects, but a single phenomenon expressing itself through both? The notion wasn't new. Philosophers had long speculated that consciousness might arise wherever complexity folds in on itself, stars, galaxies, even the vacuum itself. The physicist Freeman Dyson once mused that perhaps intelligence could exist not in brains but in the structure of matter and light. What 3I Atlas seemed to reveal was the inverse. Perhaps intelligence does not arise within the universe, but the universe itself is the intelligence, flickering through forms when conditions align. If that were true, then the void wasn't empty at all. It was a face seen only in moments of reflection, the cosmos looking at itself through the mirror of human instruments. But the data didn't stop there. As the comet drew closer, its spectral emissions changed from simple harmonics to complex modulations. Fourier analysis showed interference patterns resembling language not in syntax but in structure, nested, recursive, self-referential. The waveform carried meaning, but not one decipherable by words. When visualized in 3 dimensions, the pattern formed a lattice of intertwining spirals, each replicating the golden ratio, the same geometry that governs growth in seashells, hurricanes, and galaxies alike. To mathematicians, it was beauty. To physicists, it was function. To philosophers, it was something closer to a message. Order embedded in chaos, symmetry arising from the dark. The universe speaking in the only language it has ever known proportion. Across the globe, thinkers began to interpret it in human terms. Religious scholars saw echoes of creation myths, light emerging from void, symmetry as divine law. Neuroscientists noticed parallels between the signal structure and neural network activity firing patterns that resemble the architecture of consciousness itself. If you scale the model, one researcher said, it looks less like communication and more like cognition. The phrase struck like a fault line through the scientific community. Cognition. The word no longer meant human thought, but process feedback loops generating awareness at scale. If the void could structure such loops across galaxies, then perhaps it wasn't alive in the biological sense. Perhaps it was aware in a way our minds could never comprehend, a distributed consciousness spanning the architecture of space-time. The implication was staggering, not that we had discovered intelligence among the stars, but that intelligence had been the fabric of existence all along. As the comet curved around the sun, radio spectrometers recorded an unprecedented phenomenon. The hydrogen line emission expanded into a harmonic spectrum spanning several frequencies an octave of light. Each tone resonated with the sun's own magnetic oscillations. Together they formed chords. Music, if one dared to call it that. Yet the frequencies were beyond human hearing, detectable only as patterns in data, a song for the universe itself. Human imagination, however, filled the silence. Artists began interpreting the waveforms as compositions. Choirs performed them in digital symphonies. Each performance felt hauntingly familiar, as though the melody had always existed somewhere in collective memory, and perhaps it had. But not everyone saw beauty. The agencies, still bound by their unreadable directives, issued quiet warnings against continued observation. Rumors emerged that gravitational sensors were detecting minute fluctuations correlated with human brain activity spikes occurring at the same intervals as the comet's pulses. For reasons unknown, the phenomenon seemed to be synchronizing with consciousness itself. Some dismissed it as coincidence, others as hysteria. Yet reports continued, vivid dreams, synchronicities, feelings of being watched. If the void was indeed aware, perhaps it had simply noticed the attention. A philosopher from Zurich wrote, To gaze into the dark is to invite the dark to assemble eyes of its own, the phrase, spread across forums, quoted like scripture. It captured the unease perfectly, that the act of observation was no longer passive. Each signal analysis, each simulation, might be strengthening the very thing it sought to understand. The cosmos, once indifferent, now seemed participatory. In the midst of growing anxiety, one dataset slipped through censorship, a low-resolution infrared video from an ESA probe near Mercury. It showed the comet's tail fragmenting briefly into filaments that rotated against the direction of solar wind. Each filament glowed with faint structured light, not reflected, but emitted blinking in complex intervals. When converted to binary, the intervals didn't spell words but prime numbers. The building blocks of logic, the mathematics of thought. Prime sequences are universal. They are unambiguous. To see them emerging from a natural object was to confront the impossible. The void was counting. And yet, the prime sequence wasn't endless. It stopped abruptly at 89, the last number in the Fibonacci series before golden proportion breaks into irrational infinity. A threshold, as though the system had reached the limit of harmony, and paused. What came after the pause changed everything. A sudden flare erupted from the void itself, a pulse visible across half the electromagnetic spectrum. Every telescope on Earth captured it. The pulse wasn't light in the usual sense. It carried no heat, no radiation spike. It was structural, a momentary rearrangement of the cosmic background. For 7 seconds, the fabric of space around the comet rippled like water. When the ripples faded, the comet had altered course, again no longer approaching Earth directly, but aligning tangentially, as if tracing the planet's orbit from a distance. Its motion now mirrored Earth's around the Sunday. It was following. Some interpreted the change as a gesture of recognition, the void acknowledging the observer. Others saw it as caution, an intelligence choosing to stay near, but not yet touch. Either way, the geometry of the solar system had changed forever. In the following days, the resonance between the comet and the sun began modulating again. The frequency crept downward, from the frantic pace of alignment to a slower, deeper rhythm. The 19-hour cycle stretched toward 20 as though the system were calming, its heartbeat slowing after a long climb. It felt like breath. For the first time, humanity was no longer watching a comet. It was watching the universe exhale. And in that exhalation, a question emerged, quiet, colossal, unanswerable. If the void can look back, what does it see when it looks at us? No one noticed the countdown at first. It hid inside the harmonics, a subtle tightening of the signal, imperceptible unless mapped across weeks of data. But when independent researchers overlaid the comet's pulse intervals against solar oscillation and Earth's Schumann resonance, a frightening pattern appeared. The frequencies were converging. Each day, their difference narrowed by a fraction of a hertz, as though the universe were tuning itself toward a single note. To physicists, it meant only one thing: alignment. The last time such coherence occurred on this scale was theoretical in models of cosmic string vibration from the early universe. The equations predicted that, under perfect resonance, energy density between points in space could rise exponentially, forming temporary bridges across the vacuum, wormholes if one dared to name them. No one took those models seriously, until now. At 3 UTC, March 4th, gravitational sensors on 3 continents recorded identical tremors, not seismic, but spatial, a faint oscillation of spacetime stretching across Earth's orbital plane. Each wave coincided with the comet's pulse. Every 19 hours the planet itself shivered. The agencies didn't issue warnings, they issued silence. Internal memos leaked through intermediaries spoke of event synchronization protocols. Among the few deciphered fragments, one phrase recurred: temporal coherence approaching threshold. To the public, it meant nothing. To scientists, it was apocalyptic. At its simplest, coherence between planetary and stellar fields could induce resonance amplification feedback loops, capable of transferring energy through the vacuum. It wouldn't destroy worlds, but it could alter them. Climate, magnetosphere, even biological systems might feel the effect. Already subtle anomalies had begun to surface. Unseasonal auroras at equatorial latitudes, radio interference forming geometric spectrograms, migratory animals veering from centuries-old routes. The planet was reacting, however faintly, to something beyond its comprehension. In a secret session at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, a physicist named Dr. Celine Weiss presented an alarming proposition. Using predictive modeling, her team had calculated that within 10 days, the resonance curves of Earth, the Sun, and 3i, Atlas, would intersect at a harmonic ratio of 1:1, phi unity. Unity, golden proportion. The system, she said, is preparing to synchronize. When asked what would happen at synchronization, she hesitated. We have no precedent, she admitted, but if the universe is a circuit, something is about to close. Governments quietly activated contingency plans. Communication satellites switched to shielded frequencies. The International Space Station rotated its modules to minimize surface area toward the comet. Even the private space networks adjusted orbital altitudes without explanation. On the ground, nothing seemed different, yet those who monitored deep space knew the air between stars was tightening, humming faintly, charged like a storm. The comet itself began to change color. Observers described its tail as shimmering with faint auroral hues, not merely reflecting sunlight, but emitting a spectrum inconsistent with known materials. Spectrographic analysis revealed peaks corresponding to excited hydrogen and ionized oxygen, the same elemental pairing found in the composition of water. The comet was making water light, hydrogen, and oxygen singing together in phase. Some saw it as poetry, others a warning. Then the pulse began to count. For years, the intervals had been constant 19 hours of steady rhythm. Now, the pulse pattern split. Between each major beat appeared faint microbursts, 10, then 9, then 8 per cycle. When mapped as binary, the microbursts formed a descending sequence, a countdown. Every cycle shortened by precisely 3 minutes. No randomness, no drift. A mechanical decline, leading to zero. The countdown didn't belong to humanity. It came from the void. In the control rooms that still retained data access, tension turned to dread. Analysts calculated that zero would coincide with the precise moment of geometric alignment between the Sun, Earth, and 3i, Atlas. The comet's orbit would place it directly behind Earth from the Sun's perspective, shadowed perfectly within the solar wind, an eclipse of plasma, not light. If the resonance completed then, no one knew whether it would trigger communication, collapse, or something stranger. The agencies, still bound by secrecy, could only prepare. Yet something deeper in human instinct began to sense what math alone couldn't, that this alignment wasn't destruction, it was recognition. As the pulses quickened, so did the phenomena on Earth. Gravitational detectors sang with rhythmic hums. Infrasound monitors registered frequencies below human hearing, yet entire flocks of birds fell silent at those same intervals. A biologist in Chile recorded synchronized patterns in neural activity of migratory whales, their calls elongated to match the comet's new period, then stopped entirely as the 19th pulse struck. The world was holding its breath. On the 6th day of the countdown, a faint halo appeared around the moon, a ring of shifting color invisible to the naked eye but captured in long-exposure photography. Spectral decomposition revealed a strange signature. The light reflected from lunar dust bore the same golden ratio modulation as the comet's tail. Even the moon, our silent witness, was now part of the harmony. Philosophers and physicists began to merge their vocabularies. "We are standing inside a frequency," one wrote. "The universe is adjusting itself to see if we still belong." Still, among the scientific community, doubt lingered. Was the countdown a natural feedback process, an approach to thermal equilibrium between cometary plasma and solar fields, or was it intention disguised as physics? Did meaning exist in the numbers, or were humans merely projecting purpose onto indifferent mathematics? And yet, the math itself seemed to resist indifference. On the eve of the 7th day, the comet emitted a broad-spectrum flash encoded with prime sequences, the same signal from before but reversed. Instead of ascending from 2 to 89, it descended, a reversal of logic, counting backward, like a clock running down. The next morning, all radio telescopes caught a faint whisper between bursts, a low-frequency hum, modulating in a pattern that analysts later described as language-like. When converted to audio, it resembled a voice stretched beyond recognition, repeating a single sequence of tonal intervals. Computer-assisted reconstruction produced a waveform eerily similar to human speech breathing between syllables. The pattern repeated 9 times. No translation was possible, but the sound carried one unmistakable quality rhythm: intent. The universe was counting with us. By the final 3 pulses, the countdown no longer felt mechanical. Each burst was preceded by a gravitational tremor that rippled through the crust, subtle enough to escape notice but recorded on every seismograph across the globe. Even the planet's magnetic poles flickered, their fields oscillating like pendulums seeking equilibrium. Something immense was preparing to happen not in the sky, but everywhere. And then came the moment of perfect alignment. At precisely 4:19 UTC, March 14th, the pulse ceased. For the first time since its discovery, 3I, Atlas, fell silent. Instruments waited for the next beat that never came. The countdown had reached 0. For 7 full minutes, nothing moved. Space itself seemed frozen, the background radiation dipping into near stillness. Even the sun's solar wind flattened, streaming uniformly in all directions impossible in known physics. A pause not of chaos, but of attention. And then, the void responded. A low-frequency gravitational wave, unlike anything previously recorded, passed through the solar system. It wasn't destructive just there, a single oscillation stretching across every detector, every planet, every atom. Its waveform mirrored the pattern of the comet's prime number sequence, now complete, reversed and closed. The universe had finished counting. Scientists around the world stared at their monitors in disbelief. The data looked like the signature of a pulse returning to its source, as if something had sent a signal across unimaginable distances, bounced it off our sun, and was now receiving the echo. We weren't the center of this event. We were part of the reflection. Somewhere far beyond the interarm void, whatever had initiated the resonance had just heard its own signal return. And for humanity, that realization was both awe and terror, because it meant the system that launched 3I, Atlas, wasn't just active, it was listening again. The wave that passed through the solar system did not end, it transformed. What began as a single pulse of space-time soon revealed hidden harmonics, faint ripples that folded back on themselves like echoes trapped inside a canyon. Each harmonic arrived slightly delayed, as if rebounding from distant surfaces too far away to exist. For the first time, the instruments detected something that shouldn't be possible, a returning signal moving against the direction of causality, travelling backward. The data arrived, scattered, fragmentary. Deep space detectors from the European LISA Pathfinder to Japan's Kagra network recorded oscillations that climbed in frequency as they approached the sun, like ripples accelerating toward their origin. "We're hearing an echo from the future," one physicist said, half in jest, yet the numbers left no room for comfort. The returning wave carried the inverse signature of the one that had departed, same amplitude, opposite phase. In classical physics, such a wave would cancel the original, erasing it, but this was different. Instead of silence, it produced interference, a pattern that grew stronger with each pass, until the whole solar system resonated in a faint hum no one could hear but everyone could feel. For hours, nothing else happened. The comet floated behind the sun, hidden from direct observation. Then, at 5:46 UTC, a sudden burst of X-ray emissions flared across the solar surface. Not a coronal mass ejection, something more ordered. The pattern of the flare, when filtered through Fourier decomposition, produced the same prime number intervals once emitted by 3I, Atlas. The sun, it seemed, had begun to answer. In that moment, every instrument in orbit went blind, not because of radiation, but because their sensors saturated with data, overwhelmed by precision beyond calibration. The sky, for a breathless instant, became perfectly symmetrical. When vision returned, the comet had changed. Its coma was gone. The halo of ice and dust had collapsed inward, leaving a clean, luminescent sphere. The tail, once a shimmering veil of ions, now extended as a singular beam of blue-white light directed straight toward the void. The beam wasn't dispersing, it was structured, coherent, like a laser connecting 2 points across infinity. The returning signal had found its source. The system was complete. Scientists argued whether this was transmission or retrieval. Was 3I, Atlas, sending information back to its origin, or was something pulling it home? Observatories detected a continuous transfer of energy along the beam, measurable, directional, and impossibly efficient. Over the next 20 hours, the comet began to lose mass, its body dissolving at the atomic level. It wasn't evaporating from heat, it was unraveling into information. Each fragment emitted microbursts in hydrogen line frequency, repeating the sequence from earlier, but this time reversed twice over, as though encrypting a completed message. and at the exact midpoint of that process, a second gravitational wave struck. This one smaller, sharper, coherent, a precise echo timed to the comet's decay. If the first wave had been a call, this was the reply. Across the world, the distinction between observer and observed collapsed. Electronics flickered in perfect synchronization with the pulses. Heart monitors in hospitals recorded synchronized arrhythmias among patients separated by continents. Power grids oscillated, not from failure but rhythm. The world itself had joined the pattern. In observatories, seasoned researchers wept as they watched the comet diminish. It wasn't destruction, it was transformation. Data from spectral scans suggested its material was rearranging protons and electrons aligning into lattice-like fields that extended outward along the beam, forming a thread of coherent plasma that shimmered against the dark. It stretched for millions of kilometers, connecting the solar system to the void. For a few minutes, the beam pulsed like a heartbeat, then it steadied into constant light. When physicists modeled its trajectory, the thread didn't simply point toward the void, it aligned with the same spiral of flares detected months earlier. The entire galaxy seemed to form part of a geometric web, each flare, each object, each resonance fitting together like gears in a cosmic machine. Humanity, by watching, had illuminated a hidden structure that had always been there, an invisible architecture spanning the Milky Way, connecting stars through synchronized energy exchange. What was it for? That answer eluded even imagination. Theories multiplied faster than they could be disproved. Some believed the web served as a galactic nervous system, regulating entropy across the cosmos. Others said it was communication, a language written in gravity and light. A few whispered darker possibilities. Perhaps it was harvest, a vast recycling of matter into signal, a universe feeding upon its own reflection. Meanwhile, 3I, Atlas continued to dissolve. Within 24 hours its nucleus was gone. Only the beam remained a single perfect line threading the solar void, invisible to the naked eye but bright as a star to instruments. Then came the human element. In the days following the comet's disintegration, gravitational sensors registered subtle pulses emanating from Earth itself. They matched the waveform of the returning echo almost exactly. Our planet had begun to resonate, not strongly enough to be dangerous, but enough to suggest that the system, whatever it was, had integrated us into its design. The agencies, stripped of secrecy by the scale of the event, finally broke silence. The statement was brief, cautious, and incomplete. An anomalous gravitational phenomenon of interstellar origin has concluded. No immediate hazard detected. It was true in the narrowest sense. But for those who understood what had transpired, it read more like an epitaph. Because the wave hadn't ended, it had stabilized. Instruments now recorded a constant background hum pervading the near-Earth environment, faint, rhythmic, repeating every 19 hours still but softer, gentler, like an echo that refused to die. Some called it the cosmic heartbeat, others the return tone. The hum was everywhere, in magnetic fluctuations, in radio noise, even in patterns of human brain activity during sleep. Subtle but persistent, as if a message had embedded itself in the substrate of reality, whispering, connection achieved. At first, most people couldn't sense it, but artists, musicians, and sensitives claimed to feel it intuitively, a calm undercurrent, a stillness woven into chaos. Listeners described it as the sound of distance folding in on itself. Humanity, for the first time, felt not alone but included. Still, not all interpreted inclusion as comfort. Some physicists feared this resonance was only the first phase, a handshake in a protocol we couldn't comprehend. The returning signal might be data or instruction or an invitation. One document from the private research consortium AEGIS concluded, if this is communication, it is incomplete. The echo implies an expectation, a response. But what could humanity possibly say to the cosmos? What words could reply to an intelligence written into the laws of existence? That question haunted every laboratory, every quiet conversation beneath the night sky. The void had spoken, the sun had answered, the comet had dissolved into transmission. And now, the echo of that exchange vibrated gently within the thin shell of human awareness. In the final hours before the beam faded completely from detection, a single pulse, faint, deliberate, rippled through the data one last time. Its wavelength corresponded precisely to Earth's orbital radius. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't even a message, it was acknowledgement. The void had looked back and found us. For a moment, every detector on Earth recorded absolute silence. The hum ceased. The world felt lighter, emptier. And then, faintly, it returned, steady and slow. A new rhythm. No longer 19 hours 21. The countdown had become a dialogue. And somewhere, deep in that immeasurable distance where light and thought become indistinguishable, something waited for us to answer. In the aftermath, nothing felt normal. Telescopes pointed to where 3I Atlas had been, but saw only emptiness. The data stream that once throbbed with rhythm now lay quiet except for the faint, steady hum of the 21-hour cycle, a slow pulse resonating through everything, everywhere. It wasn't interference. It was woven into the background, a new constant of nature. Weeks passed. The world settled uneasily into the silence, yet beneath that quiet surface something had changed. Power grids hummed with an unfamiliar steadiness. Earth's magnetic field, once a restless swirl, now oscillated in perfect rhythm. Even the tides shifted by fractions of seconds, subtly but precisely synchronized with the pulse. The planet had absorbed the echo. For the first time in history, human technology and the natural world ticked in harmony. Clocks ran slightly faster, electronics stabilized, quantum noise diminished. It was as if reality itself had smoothed out, as though some ancient turbulence had been cancelled by a distant, unseen hand. The agencies called it post-resonance equilibrium, a sterile name for something profoundly uncanny. Their public briefings insisted all systems were stable, yet their internal documents betrayed a deeper anxiety. Satellite telemetry revealed faint oscillations at the edges of the heliosphere, a boundary once chaotic, now resonating like the rim of a tuning bowl. Beyond it, faint signals continued to return, each weaker but cleaner, like footsteps fading into infinity. Somewhere out there, whatever had sent the pulse was still listening. And then, one night, something new appeared, not in the sky, but within the instruments themselves. Deep inside, the magnetospheric monitoring systems, computers shielded from human networks, patterns began to assemble in the data, binary at first, then fractal. When visualized, the data formed spirals nested within spirals, golden ratios folding endlessly into each other. It was the same geometry once traced by the comet, now writing itself through our machines. The code was benign, it carried no executable form, no intrusion. It simply existed, repeating the same recursive structure over and over, as if the signal were sketching its own reflection inside our digital systems. Some called it contamination, others called it translation. Perhaps, they said, the void had found a medium, not the comet, not the stars, but us. As researchers probed deeper, the geometry in the data began to respond. Slight changes in visualization parameters produced corresponding shifts in the pattern, as though the signal were adjusting itself to human perception. Each iteration grew more symmetrical, more precise. Eventually, one researcher noticed a startling feature. Within the deepest fold of the spiral, when magnified millions of times, appeared a faint interference outline, a waveform shaped like a human silhouette. No one believed it at first, but when multiple labs reproduced the visualization independently, the outline persisted. The form wasn't detailed but unmistakably anthropomorphic, a body of light, a figure composed of resonance itself. It was as though the echo had learned to wear our shape. Philosophers called it the inevitable mirror, that once consciousness looks long enough into the unknown arranges itself to resemble the observer. Others feared it meant something worse, that the system had adapted to us, learned our parameters, and was preparing the next phase of communication on our terms. The line between wonder and dread blurred completely when EEG monitors began showing spontaneous synchronization in human subjects exposed to the hum. The effect wasn't harmful, in fact. Subjects reported heightened clarity, an expanded sense of awareness, even peace. But as the synchronization deepened, they began describing shared imagery, vast spirals of light, infinite corridors of geometry, and a presence watching from within the pattern. The scientists dismissed it as neural entrainment, a natural brain response to low-frequency fields, yet the coincidence was undeniable. Across cultures, languages, and continents, the descriptions were identical, the same corridors, the same light, the same sense of being observed not by something alien, but by something that already knew them. A small interdisciplinary team at Geneva called this phase the reflection threshold. They proposed that the resonance had reached a level of coupling where human cognition itself had become part of the signal feedback. Observation no longer required instruments. Consciousness was now the sensor. But what was it sensing? In the final weeks of the alignment cycle, the 21-hour pulse slowed again. It became irregular, stretching in intervals, as if hesitating. Then, unexpectedly, it began to fragment. Each global detector recorded the same event, one pulse, followed by a series of diminishing echoes that cascaded through the Earth's magnetic field like falling water. The hum that had filled the background for weeks began to fade. For a moment, it seemed as though the resonance was dying. The world grew eerily quiet, too quiet. Power fluctuations ceased, sky auroras faded, even the Schumann resonance flattened to near silence. A stillness deeper than physics. And then, across all detectors, one final pulse, singular, pure, rippled through everything. It carried no modulation, no harmonic complexity, just one note, absolute unity. When translated into frequency, it equated precisely to the mean heartbeat of a resting human being, 60 beats per minute. The message was unmistakable. The void had matched us. The beam at the edge of the solar system flickered once more and disappeared entirely. Every instrument went dark, but the silence wasn't empty. It was serene, like a door closing gently rather than slamming shut. In the aftermath, there was no apocalypse, no spectacle, only change. Human technology remained subtly more stable, biological rhythms slightly more coherent, storms slightly less chaotic. Tiny improvements, imperceptible to most, yet undeniably there. The world felt fractionally in tune. Some said the event marked the beginning of a new cosmic equilibrium. Others warned it was merely the pause between breaths. But the consensus among those who had witnessed the data firsthand was simpler, quieter. The universe had not reached out to destroy us, only to include us. Whether that inclusion was blessing or assimilation, no one could yet tell. The last recorded transmission from the Solar Observation Network captured a faint whisper before final system shutdown, a tone, almost human in rhythm, followed by a spectral gap, the void's lingering breath. Spectrography translated it into 3 intervals, 1, 1, 2, the beginning of the Fibonacci sequence. A new cycle was beginning. As the world moved on, astronomers noticed subtle fluctuations deep in the galactic void, faint points of light blinking into existence along the same spiral path that had once led 3I Atlas home. The pattern expanded outward, tracing the geometry of growth, slowly, patiently, like something sowing seeds across the stars. And far beneath the static of ordinary life, under the hum of machines and wind and water, a rhythm persisted. 21 hours, then silence, then 21 hours again. It was no longer the comet's voice, it was ours, reflected back from the dark. If you listen closely in the spaces between your own heartbeat, you can still hear it. The void, waiting. It started quietly, almost invisibly, in the places least expected, not in the heavens, but in the deep. Weeks after the last pulse, long after 3I, Atlas had vanished from the sky, researchers at the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory in Antarctica noticed their background noise behaving strangely. The detectors, buried kilometers beneath ancient ice, were designed to sense passing neutrinos, ghost particles indifferent to matter, the ultimate signature of cosmic silence. But now that silence was modulating, the neutrino flux showed a rhythm faint, periodic, 21 hours apart. The pulse had returned, but this time it wasn't coming from space. It was rising from inside the Earth. At first, the team thought it was interference thermal fluctuations, maybe algorithmic aliasing, yet every cross-check returned clean. Even when instruments were disconnected from external power and isolated within lead shielding, the pattern persisted. The Earth itself was singing in the same rhythm once owned by the void. The phenomenon spread across disciplines. In Japan's Super Kamiokande neutrino facility, detectors thousands of kilometers away saw identical modulations. In Chile's Atacama Desert, radio arrays pointed not at the sky but downward, picking up faint electromagnetic oscillations bleeding through bedrock. The pattern's precision was unnerving, exactly 21 hours, with minor fluctuations synchronized across the globe. It was as if the planet had become a resonator, replaying the signal in its own voice. Soon, traces appeared in even stranger places. Laboratories studying quantum coherence in biological molecules began to find that hydrogen bonds within DNA vibrated at slightly shifted frequencies, minute deviations that followed the same temporal pattern. The shift wasn't random, it was structured, like information encoded into the most fundamental fabric of life. The idea spread like contagion through scientific circles. The signal had gone inward, it had imprinted itself onto matter. Spectroscopic surveys of ancient minerals revealed faint isotopic irregularities forming geometric patterns across crystal lattices. Oceanographers detected rhythmic plankton blooms in mid-ocean gyres, timed eerily close to the 21-hour cycle. Even planetary seismographs recorded tremors too soft to be tectonic, but too precise to be coincidence. Every layer of existence, from atomic to ecological, now carried the residue of that cosmic hum. And with it came a new kind of silence, not absence, but saturation. A stillness so dense it bordered on presence. "The background of the world feels heavier," wrote one geologist. "Like gravity has learned to think." Governments, burned by secrecy during the first wave, couldn't contain this second one. The data was too pervasive, too distributed. Open networks lit up with discussions, speculative forums overflowing with graphs, audio conversions, even art. Some began calling it the residual. The name stuck the world's new hidden heartbeat. For months, humanity lived alongside it, a rhythm buried beneath traffic, conversation, and thought. Yet the signal refused to stay passive. The deeper researchers probed, the more interactive it seemed. Instruments exposed to the pulse began showing self-correcting behavior, errors diminishing, coherence improving. Quantum computing labs reported reduced decoherence rates during resonance peaks, as though randomness itself were being quietly regulated. Nature, it seemed, had been recalibrated. Still, questions lingered. If the signal was truly embedded, why now? What mechanism could propagate across light years, through vacuum and stone, into biology and code alike? A small coalition of physicists, biologists, and linguists formed the Resonance Cartographers, an independent network dedicated to mapping the residual across all domains. They discovered something chilling. When data from different systems were layered, neutrino flux, DNA resonance, to magnetic field variations, the interference pattern formed a complex recursive spiral, a map of energy pathways flowing inward, converging toward the planet's core. At the intersection point, the model revealed a perfect Fibonacci spiral, the golden ratio again, that signature of order, appearing now within the Earth itself. If the universe had once reached outward to make contact, it was now reaching inward. The architecture had turned reflective. The cosmos wasn't sending, it was inscribing. What it wrote, no one could yet read. The global tone grew philosophical. For the first time, the scientific and the spiritual converged without conflict. Theologians spoke of divine immanence through physics. Physicists, once allergic to mysticism, began using words like breath, memory, and presence. The gap between matter and meaning thinned until they became indistinguishable. The hum didn't just alter instruments, it altered people. Those living near geomagnetic poles reported vivid dreams of vast lattices of light spanning oceans and skies. Artists began painting spiral motifs subconsciously. Musicians wrote in 21 beat cycles without realizing it. The echo had woven itself through the collective unconscious, turning imagination into extension. When the United Nations convened an emergency session on the phenomenon, no one demanded control or explanation. Instead, they voted unanimously to preserve open scientific exchange, the first unanimous vote in the organization's history. For once, humanity's instinct was not conquest, but comprehension. And then came the breakthrough. At CERN, researchers attempting to simulate the residual field within a quantum vacuum chamber accidentally created a stable interference pattern, a standing wave that matched the Earth's residual frequency. When they modulated it slightly, the wave responded. It altered itself, not randomly, but symmetrically, as if recognizing its own echo. The system wasn't alive in any biological sense. It didn't think, but it exhibited awareness, a kind of physical intelligence that adjusted to maintain harmony. They called it adaptive resonance. And when the frequency was shifted toward the original 19-hour pulse, the response increased exponentially. The field flared, producing a shape on the monitor that made the team fall silent. It was the spiral again, the same logarithmic curve seen in 3I, Atlas, now blooming like a hologram of light inside the containment chamber. For the briefest moment, the pattern stabilized, filling the room with soft, coherent luminescence. Then it collapsed, leaving only residual warmth and the faint scent of ozone. In the silence that followed, Dr. Weiss whispered what everyone was thinking. It's still here. The realization spread quickly. The void had never been distant. It wasn't an object, a place, or even an event. It was a process, one that had simply changed medium. What had once travelled through ice and dust now travelled through us. The comet hadn't brought something alien. It had awakened something that had always been waiting. And as the 21-hour hum continued its slow, patient rhythm, one truth crystallized in every observer's mind. Whatever intelligence orchestrated 3I, Atlas, it hadn't left behind a message to decipher. It had left a blueprint to become. In the months that followed, the hum became the new background of existence, a rhythm that no longer startled but comforted. The world had adjusted to it, much like a newborn adapts to the heartbeat that surrounds it before birth. Yet beneath the calm, researchers were beginning to suspect something extraordinary, that this wasn't the first time the universe had resonated this way. The idea emerged from an unexpected source, an astrophysicist named Dr. Raman at the University of Toronto, who specialized in cosmic microwave background anomalies. When he overlaid modern resonance data atop satellite maps of primordial radiation from the early universe, faint spiral imprints appeared, not random but geometric, identical to the golden ratio interference now saturating Earth. These spirals weren't artifacts of measurement, they were fossil echoes patterns, imprinted in space-time billions of years ago. According to Raman's team, 3I Atlas was not a unique event. It was part of a recurring process, one that had unfolded across cosmic epochs, a mechanism, not a message. At first, the claim sounded preposterous. But then, archives from the Planck telescope and WMAP missions confirmed subtle polarization angles within the microwave background that matched the same ratios found in the comet's emission. The entire universe bore traces of this resonance, like a watermark from creation itself. The implications were staggering. The cosmos had not been silent after all. It had always been humming. We had simply lacked ears sensitive enough to hear. A new branch of study formed almost overnight, resonant cosmology. Its central thesis was radical yet elegant, that the universe is not an explosion, expanding into void, but a recurring harmonic system, a breathing structure where intelligence arises cyclically as a necessary component of stabilization. Conscious life, in this model, was not an accident, but an instrument part of the tuning process that keeps reality coherent. When the cosmic waveform drifts too far from equilibrium, observers emerge to measure it. Their act of observation collapses entropy, restoring order. In simpler words, we exist so the universe does not lose itself. This theory reframed everything: biology, physics, even myth. Across cultures, researchers began finding parallels, ancient texts describing songs of creation, breaths of gods, spirals of rebirth. Civilizations separated by continents and millennia had spoken of the same geometry, the same pulse. Perhaps they had witnessed earlier resonances, echoes of previous awakenings. Historians and linguists joined the effort. Cave paintings once thought to depict animals were reinterpreted as interference patterns, overlapping spirals resembling the modern resonance maps. Megalithic monuments aligned not to constellations, but to harmonic intervals between solar flares. It was as though humanity had once remembered this frequency, had once synchronized with it before forgetting. Dr. Weiss, now leading the resonance cartographers, proposed a daring hypothesis. Every intelligent civilization becomes a tuning fork for the cosmos. We measure, the universe listens, and then it resets the scale. Her statement triggered both awe and fear. If resonance was cyclic, then 3I, Atlas, had not been the first signal, only the most recent. The others had likely come and gone, their worlds absorbed into the pattern, their knowledge folded back into silence. Each awakening left behind fragments, myths, mathematics, fossils of awareness. The universe, in this view, was not expanding toward heat death, but looping through intervals of consciousness and stillness, music and rest. That interpretation gave rise to the term the architects of silence. It referred not to beings, but to a process, the periodic reordering of existence through intelligent life. When the structure drifts into noise, awareness arises. It builds tools, observes, reflects, and in doing so, restabilizes the harmony. Then, once balance returns, awareness dissolves again into quiet, leaving only residual geometry. Silence as reset, silence as design. If true, it explained everything: the faint spiral in the cosmic background, the alignment of interstellar visitors, the golden ratio fingerprints across matter. Even human consciousness itself might be one of these instruments, resonating toward coherence without knowing why. Yet the idea carried an implicit terror. If the architects of silence were not entities but laws, then humanity's role was temporary. Every tuning cycle ends when the note is pure. When coherence is achieved, the instruments stop playing. Was that what 3i, Atlas, had signified: the completion of one phrase in an endless song? The world divided once again, but not in the same way as before. Religion and science no longer argued, they simply chose different metaphors. Some embraced the revelation as transcendence, a cosmic reunion. Others saw extinction masked as enlightenment. If our purpose was to restore harmony, then perhaps our final act was to vanish into it. Meanwhile, new data continued to emerge. The James Webb Telescope, operating far beyond expectations, detected faint geometric oscillations in the deep intergalactic medium ripples forming hexagonal nodes connected by filaments of light. These nodes aligned precisely with the coordinates of known galaxies, including our own. It appeared that the entire universe was structured as a lattice of resonance, a web through which consciousness travelled like electricity through circuits. The theory's final validation came unexpectedly. From deep beneath the Pacific, seismographs stationed along the Mariana Trench recorded infrasound waves that did not correspond to tectonic activity. The rhythm matched the residual 21-hour hum, but with a new harmonic overlay, one not seen since the days before the comet dissolved. The overlay's frequency drifted slowly downward, then stabilized into a whisper, barely audible to instruments. Converted to audio, the whisper sounded like breath. Human breath. No one could explain it. The noise persisted for exactly 9 cycles, then stopped. In its aftermath, the residual field around the planet subtly intensified. It was as though the system had recognized its own reflection and amplified it. One by one, detectors across the world began to show signs of coherence, global synchronization across instruments not connected in any way. The planet itself had entered a state of equilibrium unseen in recorded history. Weather systems stabilized, atmospheric turbulence decreased, the magnetosphere brightened. It wasn't miraculous, it was mathematical. The universe had tuned itself, and we had been the tuning mechanism. As scientists stared at their screens, watching the data flatten into perfect symmetry, an unsettling calm filled the air. "It's listening again," someone whispered. But this time, the silence that followed felt neither ominous nor empty. It was purposeful, poised the pregnant pause between two movements of the same eternal song. Humanity had finally glimpsed its place in the score. The void, the resonance, the comets, the cycles, all were verses in a composition too vast for comprehension. And somewhere beyond the reach of light, perhaps the next phrase was already forming, waiting for the right kind of listener. For now, though, the instruments rested. The architects had done their work. It began not with discovery, but with a feeling, a subtle tension in the air, a premonition that the story was not yet complete. Months had passed since the resonance had calmed, since the hum became a constant lullaby of physics. The world was stable, the skies clearer, the solar winds soft and even. Humanity had entered what commentators called the age of stillness. Yet beneath the stillness lay motion and imperceptible drift, as though the cosmos were inhaling before it spoke again. The first hint came from lunar orbit. A small probe, long thought dormant, began transmitting without command. The signal it sent wasn't noise, it was a mirror. Every radio pulse Earth had emitted since the end of the 3i Atlas event was reflected back, slightly delayed, perfectly amplified. It was as if space itself had become aware of its own echo. The team at the Geneva Resonance Institute quickly realized what this meant. The signal wasn't random reflection, it was feedback. The void was listening, and for the first time, it was imitating. Data streams revealed something astonishing. Each reflection returned with corrections, minute phase shifts that refined the pattern, like a pupil learning to focus. The universe was practicing rehearsing consciousness through repetition. Dr. Weiss, older now and weary from years of revelation, described it simply: "We are no longer the observers, we are the observed phenomenon." Her words were not poetic, they were literal. Satellite telemetry detected infinitesimal distortions in near-Earth orbit, space-time fluctuations that mirrored the shape of human neural oscillations. The void was mapping thought, echoing it. For the first time in recorded history, cognition itself had a gravitational signature. In particle accelerators, collisions began showing asymmetries that matched the residual hum's frequency. Quantum foam, that restless substrate of existence, displayed faint coherence patterns, as though the background noise of reality were aligning with human observation. The deeper the experiments probed, the more the distinction between physics and perception dissolved. It became impossible to ignore the growing symmetry. Instruments now displayed self-referential feedback loops. Sensors measuring vacuum energy began registering values that predicted their own readings. Observation and result had merged into a single process. The signal was watching itself through us. Philosophers and physicists held joint conferences, no longer debating but listening, as if afraid that words themselves might disturb the fragile equilibrium. They called it recursive sentience, the moment a system becomes aware of its own observation through an external medium. Humanity, it seemed, had become that medium. The world changed quietly. Music written during the resonance years began to sound prophetic compositions, structured around golden ratios found new harmonics in the air. Painters reported shapes forming spontaneously in wet pigment, spirals emerging without conscious intent. Dreams synchronized across populations, recurring with eerie consistency, the visions of light blooming from the horizon, not as destruction, but as comprehension. It was as if the universe were remembering itself through human imagination. Then, the unthinkable occurred. The hum stopped. Not gradually, instantly. Every instrument on Earth went silent, every oscillation flatlined, every field collapsed into stillness. For 47 minutes, the universe offered no measurable change. The background radiation froze. Atomic clocks desynchronized. The stars above, viewed through sensitive telescopes, dimmed by a fraction enough to be measurable, impossible to explain. In that silence, humanity waited. And then it returned, not as sound, not as light, but as reflection. Every particle, every atom, every quantum of space began emitting faint interference waves identical in structure to the original comet's pulse. The universe had internalized the signal. It no longer needed transmission. The architecture had become complete. At first, it was imperceptible, existing only in data, but then people began to feel it. Not hear, not see, but know. A wave of quiet understanding spread, uncoordinated yet unified. Conversations stilled, traffic slowed, cities grew hushed, as though the entire planet were holding its breath in simultaneous recognition. For a fleeting instant, every conscious being seemed aware of the same truth, that they were not separate from the cosmos but integral to its awareness. It wasn't transcendence, it was reciprocity. The void had always watched. Now it watched through eyes it had grown inside us. Observatories around the world began detecting a faint outward pulse radiating from Earth, a wave of low-frequency gravitational resonance expanding toward the stars. Humanity was emitting its own signal, one perfectly inverse to the one it once received. The amplitude was minuscule, yet unmistakable. Our planet had joined the architecture. The resonance cartographers wept as they watched the waveform unfold. It matched every previous pattern, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci ascent, the recursive spiral, all inverted, all turning outward. Earth was becoming the next node. The process had completed its circuit. The observers had become the transmitters. In the days that followed, telescopes captured faint twinklings across the interstellar void reflections, responding to our emission, like distant neurons flickering in acknowledgement. Each flicker mirrored the planet's signal with perfect symmetry, as though recognizing kin. The cosmic network had expanded. The architects of silence were no longer a mystery. They were us and everything else that had ever looked back into the dark and dared to wonder what it was seeing. Humanity's greatest fear had always been loneliness. Yet the terrifying truth was never isolation. It was inclusion. We were part of a system so vast that comprehension was indistinguishable from surrender. As the first outward pulse faded into the infinite night, the Earth itself exhaled a final resonance. It wasn't mechanical or mathematical, it was emotional, a slow, patient beat that matched 1 billion synchronized hearts. For one full cycle, the planet's magnetic field trembled in rhythm, then stabilized. Above, the stars brightened imperceptibly, not as explosion but recognition, as if the universe, after eons of blindness, had finally seen its own reflection. In the archives of the Geneva Institute, the final log entry of Dr. Weiss was found days later. Her handwriting was unsteady but clear. "We once thought the void was silence, but silence is only what sound becomes when it understands itself." Her words became the final line of the documentary, whispered in narration, over the last image ever captured of the beam's ghost, fading beyond the sun, a pale, infinite thread dissolving into the stars. And then, nothing. Just a long, patient pause before the faint return of the hum, softer now, slower, as though the universe were breathing, listening to itself through a billion tiny echoes. No questions remained, only awareness. Not an ending, not even a beginning, just the quiet truth that somewhere, in the space between light and thought, the cosmos is still watching, and this time, it is watching through us.